Hi everyone, welcome to the Mummy Movie Podcast, where we are looking at Las Luchadoras contra la Mumia, otherwise known as the Wrestling Women versus the Aztec Mummy. So this is a film that involves female luchador wrestlers taking down a gang called the Black Dragons, which in turn leads to them having a wrestling match against two judo masters for the possession of an ancient codex, which then in turn leads to them raising an Aztec mummy from the dead who they then have to combat. And I mean, I'm sorry, but who can look at that plot and, well, not be at least a little bit, mildly entertained? It's just so ridiculous, and it actually made me quite excited to watch this. And I mean, don't get me wrong, there's very little chance that this film was ever going to be technically good, but my goodness, surely it's got to at least be entertaining. And what's more, there are even two versions of this film. One is called The Wrestling Women versus the Aztec Mummy, and another called The Rock and Roll Wrestling Women versus the Aztec Mummy, which is literally a musical. I mean, I will be honest, I didn't watch that version, largely because it's 30 minutes shorter, and, well, apparently is absolutely awful as well, but I like that it exists at least. I should probably also just say, this film was originally released in Spanish, and when it was dubbed into English, some of the names of the characters were Americanized. So one character named Chucho Gomez, for instance, was renamed Tommy, and another one named Chila was renamed Charlotte. I watched the dub version of this, so I will be referring to their Americanized names. Anyway, in terms of the format for the episode, we shall start by having a look at the historical, accuracy of the film, or, well, at least the history that the film presents. And then I shall review the film and just rate it out of 10. But before then, as usual, it is time for my dramatic intro. Right, you are a successful luchador wrestler who has just won a competitive tag team match. You head back to your locker room where you meet your husband, a well-respected police officer. As you are recovering, a strange, scared man approaches you and claims that he is being pursued by the evil Black Dragon gang. He reveals that he is an archaeologist who has recently discovered an ancient codex with instructions that lead to priceless Aztec treasure. However, before he can continue, suddenly he collapses, and you notice a poisoned dart in his back. It is now up to you to discover this codex. But little do you realise that it will lead into a terrible battle. Not only will you have to fight an evil gang, you will have to face the supernatural. Soon, the battle will be between the Wrestling Women versus the Aztec Mummy. Right, so let's have a look at the history the film presents. As usual, please do bear in mind that I'm an Egyptologist, not an expert on the Aztecs, despite what some people think they are not the same thing. Near the beginning of the film, it is revealed that the archaeologists have found an Aztec codex which leads to treasure. Firstly, the Aztecs did indeed use codex. They were basically manuscripts that gave information on various aspects of Aztec life. This could be anything from their history and science to things like, tribute paid and religion. As far as I'm aware, though, you wouldn't typically get any that would, lead to treasure. But, I guess you could argue that tribute lists or religious codex might lead to objects that would be valuable today. It's a bit of a stretch in all honesty, but okay, I guess. Later in the film, we see a flashback scene to the city of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec civilization. Firstly, Tenochtitlan was legitimately the capital. I have spoken about this before. I think it was on my episode on American Mummy, but at its height it had a population of 200,000. Bear in mind, the biggest cities in Europe at that time only had about 50,000, so we're talking about a huge city for the time. There are a few interesting things in this scene. First of all, we see a lot of Aztec warriors lining the streets. These warriors are holding spears, and they also have quite small round shields. In fairness, both of these weapons were used by the Aztecs. When it came to projectiles, the Aztecs used spears, bows, and slingshots. In all honesty, the spears and bows were not as good as in other parts of the world. Very often, pretty simple armour could stop them outside of, the odd lucky shot. Though the Aztec slingshot was pretty good. Normally slingshots were not used to kill, however, they were instead used to stun an enemy so that they could be taken captive. However, in reality, a lot of the reason these projectiles were not quite as good is because the Aztecs tended to focus more on close-quarter combat, and as such their preferred weapon was called a macana. This was basically a heavy oak club with a flat top. Then, this flat top was either studded with obsidian or flint blades. I'm not gonna lie, that sounds pretty badass. I will admit, if someone was charging at me with one of these, I would be sprinting in the other direction. I don't even think Usain Bolt would be able to catch me in that situation. As for the small round shields in the scene, these do actually resemble the type used by the Aztecs. Typically, these were made from either bamboo or fire-hardened wood that was reinforced by hide. We also see a variety of different outfits here, and, well, again, these aren't completely wrong. Most of the soldiers are wearing rather plain clothing, but as we get to the more experienced warriors, their clothing gets more elaborate, and, well, this was actually the case. Basically, more experienced warriors who had, taken more captives, for instance, gained more elaborate clothing to show off their position. Further to this, some of the warriors in this film wear headrests that resemble coyote, jaguars, and frightful spectres. Again, this is accurate, and in fact, the film even specifies that this is what the masks were supposed to represent. Later in this scene, we find out that there's this young woman who is going to be sacrificed. The film then states that she has had to remain a virgin up until this point. During the ceremony, so just as she's about to be sacrificed, a man then interrupts and reveals that he is her secret lover, and they basically try and run away together. However, they are then both caught and put to death. Okay, so obviously there's a few things to talk about here, so, well, first things first, it was more common for men to be sacrificed than women in Aztec culture, but that's not to say that women were never sacrificed. It wasn't a hard and fast rule. However, the woman in the film is kind of made out to be a priestess of some kind, and to my knowledge, priestesses would not have been sacrificed, though there are instances where noble women would be sacrificed. But anyway, putting that aside, let's say that she's a priestess because, well, that's kind of how the film is representing her. There are some parts here that are accurate, whilst there are other parts that are not. First things first, the film states that she must remain a virgin. In fairness, both priests and priestesses in the Aztec culture did have to remain celibate. Very often, young women became priestesses before they got married, and so, yeah, they absolutely were virgins. Normally, the male and female priests were completely separated from each other, having, different quarters in the temple, and this was essentially done to protect them from their own temptations. However, it is worth noting that older women, often, widowed women, for instance, would also become priestesses, and, well, yes, they would have to remain celibate, but they weren't necessarily virgins. So I think it's probably better to say a female priest had to remain celibate. They didn't have to be a virgin. Might be a picky point, but I kind of do think it is an important one as well. Further to this, if a priest or priestess did have sex, both they and their lover would normally be put to death. So, again, the film is kind of correct in this regard. I probably should just say it's definitely worth noting that a priest or priestess did not have like a lifelong commitment in the Aztec culture. Often they would take the vow to be a priest or priestess for a couple of years, at which time they would leave the temple and get married. Then, later on, let's say if they did become widowed, they could return to the temple again. But either way, we are seeing that there are some little bits here that are correct. On the downside, however, if we are being a bit picky, I guess, priestesses tended to have their hair cut quite short when they entered the temple, where the women in this film has quite long hair. So, overall, I guess unsurprisingly, there isn't that much to talk about history-wise here. However, what little there is does seem to have at least had some vague research done. Okay, so onto the review. Believe it or not, there are actually some genuine positives here. Firstly, although maybe a bit all over the place, it's undeniable that the plot is very colourful. I mean, as I said a few times during this episode, we have luchador wrestlers, judo masters, an evil gang, an ancient codex, an Aztec mummy, hypnotism, believe it or not, and an ancient love story. And although a lot of these elements are admittedly very clunky in their, like implementation, it did at least mean that I wasn't bored while watching this. Like, it was hard to be bored. On top of this, although very silly, I actually quite enjoyed the whole angle with the luchador wrestlers versus the judo masters. Essentially, this started with, a gang war between the luchador wrestlers and the Black Dragon gang, and ended with the judo masters, who are basically the sisters in the Black Dragon gang, challenging the luchador wrestlers to a match with the ancient codex on the line. And I mean, when I say match, I mean like it's literally in a ring. It's been advertised to the public, so it's like surrounded by a crowd and everything. It's so silly, but it absolutely plays out like a wrestling angle. Like, I could imagine this in, admittedly, one of the more like cartoony eras of the WWE or something like that. However, on top of that, I genuinely didn't know who was going to win here. After all, we know that later on, an Aztec mummy was going to rise from the dead. So it kind of would have made sense for the judo masters to kind of like cheat to win. And then, the gang could rise the mummy to do their bidding or something along those lines. So, although ridiculous, I was entertained by this and even a little bit invested. Also, there was quite a cool twist afterwards, because it turns out that the Black Dragons have set up a camera in the home of the wrestlers. As such, even if the wrestlers do win, they can just watch as they translate the codex and get the information that way. Don't get me wrong, the Black Dragons were admittedly very lucky that they translated the codex in the one room they had the camera set up, but, it was still a cool idea. When it comes to the appearance of the mummy in the film, although he may be one of the slowest mummies in any film I've seen, and, well, that's saying something. I mean, I would say he's only mildly faster than the mummy in the Curse of the Mummy's Tomb. In fairness, he does look pretty freaky. Like, he's incredibly, dry and withered, and it is genuinely the stuff of nightmares. And don't get me wrong, this is a little bit in a funny way, but the mummy's face did genuinely make me feel uncomfortable. Adding to this, I quite like the way they defeated the mummy. Basically, they cover him in a blanket and chain him to a pillar in the pyramid. Then, as the mummy, pulls himself free, the pillar falls over and the pyramid, basically collapses down on top of him. I genuinely think this was a really intelligent way of defeating the mummy. It was essentially using his own strength against him. I will admit, though, that's pretty much where the outright positives end. Fortunately, though, there are plenty of things here that helped with my, enjoyment, albeit unintentionally. So, for instance, as I'm sure will, shock everyone, the acting was hysterically bad in this film, but it was the kind of charming bad where it was never overly annoying, so I don't mind that too much. Also, the soundtrack reminded me a little bit of Plan 9 from Outer Space, so there's some real kind of B/Z movie charm here. Further to this, I felt that there was a bit of a kind of goofy Scooby-Doo-esque feel. Like I said, this is largely because the whole premise and plot is very unbelievable and colourful. Even outside of the whole Luchador Wrestlers versus Aztec Mummies, you even get one scene where one of the characters, Charlotte, is hypnotised by the gang and sent back to the house so she can kind of like spy on everyone. Or even when it comes to the mummy itself. So, an Aztec mummy fighting luchador wrestlers is, a ridiculous enough premise on its own. But they also seem to get the mummy confused with vampires, because not only can it not go out in the sunlight, but it can also transform into a bat, and later still, it even turns into a tarantula. In fact, at one point in the film, it turns into a bat, and one of the characters literally yells, "It's a vampire now!" Then it turns back into a mummy, and they go, "Now it's a mummy again!" And then it turns into a tarantula because, well, why not, I guess. So, in fairness to the film, even with a lot of the parts that weren't actually that great, I quite liked them. Ultimately, they're just so silly that they're kind of hard not to smile at. Now, unfortunately, this cannot stretch to the entire film. There are some genuinely bad bits here. For a start, although the plot was admittedly very colourful, like I said earlier, it was also very clunky and as such hard to follow. I think this was partly because it felt like some scenes had been cut out, and as a result, some parts either, rushed along or just didn't make sense at all. For instance, in one scene, two of the good guys go to a hotel room to get part of the codex. They are then ambushed and kidnapped. Then, the very next scene is just the other heroes turning up to rescue them. There has been absolutely no talk of doing this. I'm not even sure how they know that, they were kidnapped in the first place. Even in the film's world, this would have only been like 20 minutes ago or so. So, it just doesn't really make sense. And even when it comes to the mummy, although I quite liked, how withered and genuinely, quite scary the mummy looked, it also doesn't turn up until the last, half hour of the film. For the most part, the focus is just on the gang war going on, over the ancient codex. If I'm honest, though, for me that isn't such a big deal because that storyline is also very entertaining. Plus, some of the fight scenes are just so stupid in the best way. They come across as very Adam West-esque, in their approach. 1960s Batman, if you will. I was half expecting a big sort of bubble to appear in the screen with power in it, or zoink, or gaduff, or something like that. So, overall, I think it's safe to say we are dealing with a so bad that it's good film here. I mean, I don't think anyone's going to be shocked by that. Overall, though, I will admit I was entertained by this film. We had a weird vampire mummy type thing that can, turn into a bat and a tarantula. We have a gang war that leads to a wrestling match for an ancient codex, and admittedly very charmingly bad acting. As such, even though the plot was admittedly a bit clunky and hard to follow, there was enough that entertained me here for me to forgive that. I'm still only giving this film a 4 out of 10, because I think that is ultimately what it deserves, but I do also think that it was a fun 4 out of 10, and I did have a good time watching this. I will also say, just to sort of close things off, if you did want to watch this film, it is easily found on YouTube. I will put a link to this video in the episode description. Thank you very much for listening. I certainly hope you've enjoyed this episode. And if you have, why not like, subscribe, leave a comment? Why not dress up as a mummy and wander through the streets, giving out flyers for the show? If you own a cereal company, why not create a mummy movie podcast inspired cereal? You could call it Mummios, for instance. I mean, if you do, I might just sell it on my new Patreon page, alongside the content that's already there, such as bonus episodes of the historical variety, as well as extended episodes, deleted scenes, and the ability to get all episodes 2 days early. I'm not going to lie, I'm actually pretty proud of that segue. And join me next week, where we shall be looking at The Mummy Resurrected from 2014. And you might be thinking I've already done that film. Well, you fools, you are seriously mistaken. This is different from The Mummy Rebirth or Reborn. This is The Mummy Resurrected, which should not be mistaken for The Mummy Resurrection or The Mummy Resurgence. The idea that these films have similar titles is absolutely ridiculous. Why, it's enough to make me rage of The Mummy, which is another film I have to cover. So just to clarify, next week we shall be looking at The Mummy Resurrected, as we have already covered The Mummy Reborn and Rebirth, and later on we shall cover The Mummy Resurrection and Resurgence. So next week, just to be absolutely crystal clear, we shall be covering The Mummy Resurrected from 2014. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you all have a fantastic week, and see you then.